Okay, Short Issues Podcast. We are here with two fine young gentlemen, Jerome Segal and Justinian. You guys are running for governor, governor and lieutenant governor, as a matter of fact. Could you introduce yourselves to the podcast, please?
Hi, I'm Jerome Segal. I'm running for governor.
Hi, I'm Justinian Dispenza, Lieutenant Governor.
Awesome. So to give us some run up before we get into like the deep policy issues, could you just give us some background on what's your background is, how you got here, and what makes what how does your background make you qualified to run for governor? Could you do that?
Okay, so a variety of things. In my background, I guess there's sort of like two different questions embedded in what you asked. One is how I got here, and the other is sort of what makes me qualified. They're not exactly the same thing.
Okay.
Um, the short answer, and then I'll give you the long answer. But the short answer of how I got here is I got here by entering politics in 2018. And in 2018, I entered the Maryland Democratic Party primary for US Senate, and I ran against Ben Cardin for the nomination. And I'll talk about that at some length, and I've got some very pointed things to say about our Maryland in that context. So what happened, just in terms of the narrative, is that I ran against him. The Democratic Party refused to hold any debates, any forums at all on that primary. And nobody else did either. But the fact that the Democratic Party refused to do that, even after there were 7 or 8 of us, I think 7 of us running against Cardin. None of us were well known, though was somewhat well known. I had written about 100 op-ed pieces, and at least a dozen of them were in the Washington Post, so I should have been somewhat well known, not well known, but not totally unknown. But I had never heard of any of the others, with one exception, Chelsea Manning. She was like a national story, and the only press attention was given to Chelsea Manning, and it was amazing. She had no campaign whatsoever, wasn't even a serious candidate, and she was the only one that got press attention. And her press attention was national. It was really bizarre. But she and I and a third candidate named Ricky Vaughn, we wrote an op-ed piece together in which we challenged Cardin to a debate. And he didn't even respond, and essentially refused to debate, but even refused to acknowledge the challenge. And one reporter even asked him, well, you've been challenged to a debate by your opponents in the primary. Are you refusing? No follow-up from the press at all. And the Democratic Party wouldn't follow up. And so I was so disgusted with the Democratic Party that I resigned from membership in the party, and I collected 15,000 signatures to create a new party. And I created a third party called the Bread and Roses Party of Maryland, with the explicit intention of running against Cardin in the general election, which was in November. And so I planned to do that. And then it was a bizarre series of things what happened, which is that the Board of Elections refused to recognize my signatures. I was then nominated by the party as the candidate for Senate, and they refused to give me ballot access. That is, refused to put me on the ballot in November, because they cited what's called a sore loser law that Maryland and many other states have enacted, which says that if you run for a primary and lose, you can't appear on the ballot in the general election at all, under any party for any office. Even as a Democrat, I couldn't appear on some other office. So, and Maryland has that kind of law. It's really wacko. At any rate, I challenged that law in court, in the federal courts. I lost, and I wrote my own briefs. They were amazing. I lost on the district level, and then I appealed it to the Circuit Court of Appeals, and I lost on that level also. Basically because nobody gave, they just, if I was, Alan Dershowitz, I'd have probably won. They just dismissed it. They didn't read it. They didn't follow the argumentation at all.
Hmm.
But the weird thing that happened was that after the election, for the Board of Elections, the issue was that I wanted to be on the ballot in November. After that issue was behind, there was a question of, well, what about the 15,000 were to become a registered party, right? So the Board of Elections reviewed the signatures. I had to gather some more and so on. But basically, they recognized the Bread and Roses Party of Maryland as a legitimate minority party in Maryland, which gave us the right for the two next election cycles to put our candidates on the ballot, just like the Libertarian Party and the Green Party, which at that point actually had lost their certification because in that November election, they didn't get 1% of the vote. So we had a point at which the only parties you could be in Maryland were the Republicans, the Democrats, and the Bread and Roses Party. And a lot of people who went to register were given those three choices, and they chose Bread and Roses. So we didn't ever try to get people to register to vote as Bread and Roses, but we ended up with, I don't know what, 1,200 people just, who birthdays were at the right time chose us rather than Republican and Democrat. But anyhow, then the election came around, right? And unlike the Green Party, we refused to run in any swing state. The Greens did. I thought it was abhorrent. But Maryland, Biden, had like a 30-point lead and in all the polling, and he maintained that and so on. So myself and a filmmaker, not Justin, another filmmaker, a guy named John DeGraff, wonderful long-term activist and also involved as I was in the simple living movement, and had written a book called Affluenza and What is an Economy For, and so on. And I had written Graceful Simplicity, The Philosophy and Politics of Simple Living. He was my running mate. And we decided, among other things, since we were credited in Maryland, so I ran for president, and he ran as vice presidential candidate of the Bread and Roses Party in Maryland. And we didn't do very well. And it taught us a lesson about third parties, especially when you don't have ranked choice voting. People don't want to throw their vote away. Even when we ran, I sent out like several million emails to Maryland voters saying, Biden up 30 points, safe to vote your values, vote Red and Roses. But you couldn't convince people. I mean, people just wanted to, if they thought that Biden was going to beat Trump, they wanted to be in on the kill. And if they thought that wasn't a foregone conclusion, or they wanted to be careful, then of course they rationally would vote for Biden. So I talk about this election as sort of it was my battle against Trump for Maryland that Joe Biden happened to win. But so that was, that was that. But then the question came, because we had a right also to put someone on the ballot for this coming season, which is November coming up, November 2022. And I thought the whole purpose of Bread and Roses, there's an organization called Bread and Roses that we're sort of the expression of, and the Bread and Roses Party was an expression of. And we talk about really two ways of doing electoral politics. One is, let's say, running as Bread and Roses candidates inside the Democratic Party, and the other is running on a dedicated independent third party, a Bread and Roses Party. And so that was a choice that we had to make. But the whole raison d'etre for running in electoral politics is our thesis that electoral politics is the main free speech agenda arena. And it's in electoral politics that you can talk about basics and you can change people and so on. So we're kind of like a nonprofit that engages in electoral politics as a way of building a movement. And our movement is a movement for deep cultural change. It's not for, do we want to widen, I-95? Okay, so we want to, and as a Bread and Roses socialist, we want, I wouldn't say overthrowing capitalism. I can explain it when we get there. But I have a model that's essentially called shrinking capitalism. And it's shrinking capitalism in our lives. It isn't primarily about private ownership of the means of production, unless by the means of production, you mean human capital that's in your head. Because what we're talking about is recapturing your own human capital. And that means taking it out of the market. It means, in other words, cutting down on the extent to which you're selling your human capital, your brain, as it were, to the job creators, i.e. the corporations that are out to make profit off of your brain. And so you enter into a contract with them to sell them, your soul, to put it in old-fashioned Faustian terms. But that's what, that's what capitalism is. That's what Marx talked about when he talked about the alienated labor. He wasn't talking about so much you're feeling alienated. He was talking about the verb alienate, which means to sell. And that in capitalism, for the first time in human history, people sell themselves to people who are buying. And that wasn't, that's a job system. And that didn't exist until the Industrial Revolution. So we accept it as sort of a fact of life. It's not a fact of life. It's not a fact of nature. It's a very unique, new system of human relations that in many parts of the world doesn't even exist until this day. In the northern part of this country, it's about 200 years old. In the south, it didn't even hit until 100 years ago. So we're about actually shrinking the job system, liberation from the job system, and going from I'd call say instrumental labor, which is labor time that you put in order to earn money, versus passion work, which is work that expresses your deepest self and that you would do for free if you didn't need the money. Like Justin, I mean, like myself, maybe yourself, what we found is a way of living, and even a way of making a little bit of money. Sometimes, like Justin does, if I can reveal a secret. So
Yeah.
he has a business in which he films weddings. Okay. So that's not exactly his passion. He's a photographer, and maybe he gets into it passionately, but probably if he didn't need the money, he probably wouldn't spend his time filming weddings. He made award-winning documentaries about hunger in Asia. And so he makes a certain amount of compromise. But the point is that it's a limited compromise. It's not 40 hours a week, 5 days a week, right? He's shrunk it. He's shrunk it down to something where it pays the bills, and then he lives out his passion. So that's our model. That's our model of shrinking capitalism, shrinking the role of instrumental labor in our lives and transforming it. So that actually is the heart of the way we approach every sector of all these, minuscule questions that I get asked in these forums about, are you in favor of, expanding the Beltway and having a paid toll line? Or what about the Salvation Army Bridge? Or, even what about important things like what about the Red Line in Baltimore and so on? So, of course, we say no to expanding the Beltway, no to the bridge except for safety reasons, and we say yes to the mass transit. But the question is why? You see, our reasons for doing this are totally different than anybody else's. Our reasons for doing this is the bread and roses lens, and the bread and roses lens is how do you shrink capitalism and expand passion work. And specifically, what we say is that what our objective is to shrink household spending on transportation from 20% of the household budget to 5% of the household budget. That's the goal for transportation policy. Why? It's not so people can take that money that they save and spend it on some other sector. It's rather that they can work less. They can trade off stuff for more time. And so therefore, what we're talking about is liberating, what you liberate when you go from 20% to 5%, which is 3/4 of a day. We're talking about liberating 3/4 of a day from job system, instrumental labor, to self-fulfilling, autonomous, authentic passion work. Okay. That's 3/4 of a day just through transportation sector. And the transportation sector spending on the household level is 99.9% the automobile. So we want to do nothing that accommodates the automobile. We want to drive, as it were, either drive the automobile off the road, so to speak, or actually, more important to us, I mean, you want to do something, of course, for climate change. And so this is our answer to climate change. We focus, of course, on, the gas-powered automobile, and we want to go to EV, but we want to go to the near-free EV. We want the EV that'll be consistent with liberating 3/4 of a day from the transportation sector. And so what I talk about, among other things, is not just that goal, but the Wuling Mini. Every time I say this, I get, blank expressions. No one knows what the Wuling Mini is. Right?
There's a video on your website. I've seen it.
That's right. That's right. Right. And so, but for your listeners, the Wuling Mini, right? Okay. The Wuling Mini is a car, first of all. Okay.
It's a little car,
Best selling, and it's an electric vehicle. The best selling, I'm sorry, are we taking a break?
No, go on.
Okay. The best selling electric vehicle in the world, everyone knows about, it's the Tesla. The Tesla starts at $60,000, right? The Wuling Mini is the second best selling electric vehicle in the world. And no one in the United States knows about it because it's only sold in China. And here are the two salient, overpowering facts about the Wuling Mini. The Wuling Mini sells for $5,000, not $60,000. And there's a company, a world famous company that owns 44% of the Chinese company that produces this $5,000 electric vehicle, and it's General Motors. So General Motors owns almost half of the company that's producing a $5,000 electric car in China, and has made it the best-selling electric car in China and the second best-selling electric car in the world. Okay, so the question is, what are we going to do about it?
Yeah.
Okay, if I'm governor, what are we going to do about it?
Yeah.
Well, first of all, I'll have a conversation with General Motors, and I'll have a conversation with Detroit, and if necessary, we'll be the buying agent for the Wuling Mini, and Maryland will actually, maybe just to punish them, we won't even we won't buy it from General Motors. We'll contract with somebody else, maybe Ford, to produce. And yeah, the $5,000 Wuling Mini, it has a seatbelt, but it doesn't have airbags. It has air conditioning, probably not that powerful, and it's got a radio. I don't know if it gets FM. So whatever. So you have to add a little bit of money to the 5,000. So let's say we double it. We're talking about a $10,000 electric vehicle. The Build Back Better bill that Biden can't get through the Congress has got a $12,500 refundable subsidy if someone buys an electric vehicle, right? So if we had a $10,000 electric vehicle, which I know we can have, because it's refundable, the people who buy it will not only get it for free, and I would have them pay $1,000 or $2,000 for it, because I don't think people should get free cars. So the lowest that you could buy, this near free EV would say be $2,000. So you buy your EV for $2,000, so you have some ownership stake in it, but you still have $4,500 left over, and you use that for your electricity to pay for it. You use it for your repairs, which are low because electric vehicles are low repairs. You use it for your auto insurance. The truth of the matter is, on this scenario, we actually drive the spending of the transportation sector down to zero. So we're liberating a full day. So we can go to the 4-day week. We can go to the 4-day work week, right? The 3-day weekend, just on the basis of the Wuling Mini in Maryland with the right set of policies, right? So that's what we're talking about. We're thinking big. Now, how would we do it? Well, one is we could just be the buying agent. We could put in a contract, for 100,000, $10,000 electric vehicles with any company, foreign or domestic, that's prepared to build them. Well, a contract for 100,000 vehicles, they'll be falling all over themselves, and we'll be able to, to come up. We'll get Steve Jobs' clone, and we'll come up with a beautiful car. That'll, because we're bread and roses, right? Everything we do is roses. You gotta have a touch of beauty, right? So we'll come up with, as it were, the MacBook version of the near free EV, right? That's our goal, right? Is to break the mold. Okay. Now, how we do it, if in addition to this, if in worst comes to worst, if Detroit is not responsive for this, being socialists, we'll start our own company, right? It'll be the Maryland Car Company, and we will start, building cars and taking orders. And believe me, we'll be able to sell 5 million of them to California, and to any other progressive state that gets wind of what we're doing. And actually, as it were, if we can sell, if we can make $10,000 electric vehicles and make them near free available to every American with, $2,000 or $4,000 left over to pay for your electricity and your insurance, we'll destroy Detroit. We'll basically destroy every car maker that isn't prepared to do this. Who would buy any car except, the ultra rich? So because of that, of course, we want to go down this route, just the whisper of it. Now, if we send this video to Detroit, I think they'll start planning low-cost EVs. Because they'll say, even if Segal isn't going to get to be governor, damn it, he's blown the secret. He's blown the secret. They all know that GM owns 44% of this, and they know there can be cheap EVs in America, and they know that the reason that we're not bringing cheap EVs is because our profit maximization point is for a much higher electric vehicle. So we don't give a crap about the transition to EVs and CO2 emissions for their own sake. It's got to square with the bottom line. So, but Segal just has blown the cover, and the bottom line is suddenly shifted. And he can drive us into bankruptcy if Maryland starts producing its own cars or contracts with Toyota. So and so I'm telling you, just on the basis of this video, and Justin, just remind me if I forget, right? As soon as we get a copy of this, let's put it in the mail and send it to Detroit and send it to the press and just start to make stuff happen. Because so in any event, this is how we approach everything. Now, this is the Bread and Roses approach, and it came out of my book, which I wrote 20 years ago, called Graceful Simplicity: The Philosophy and Politics of Simple Living. And what I argued is that, yes, simple living is the good life, more time and less stuff. And every wisdom tradition in world history has known that, including the Bible, right? Which the first commandment given to the Israelites when they leave Egypt, before they get the 10 commandments. Yes, it's the fourth commandment to keep the Sabbath, that is to work only 6 days a week, right? Can't work on the seventh, right? That's the fourth commandment. But they got that at Mount Sinai. But before they got to Mount Sinai, they got it as a separate commandment. And you know what there was? There was a death penalty imposed. And there was one guy, I don't think we know his name. He was the man who went out and gathered sticks, right, on the way there. And Yahweh is a term that's actually used. We don't say that if you're religious, but my book, I wrote another book called Joseph's Bones, the struggle between God and mankind in the Bible, and it's the Bible as literature, and so I feel free to talk about the main character as Yahweh. Some people, a corruption of that is Jehovah, by the way, but Jews don't say either one. But as I say, this is Bible and literature, and which I taught for 10 years to a collective Jewish group in Tacoma Park, just to give you some of the background. But in any event, I talk about this story in the book, and God rounds up these people and then has them subject to the judgment of the Israelites, and they stone them to death. And it's quite remarkable. This is before they get to Sinai. But in any event, the whole issue of time is central. And one of the other things I point out is that actually the first thing to be declared holy in the Judeo-Christian tradition occurs in Genesis when something is declared holy. And it turns out to be a unit of time, not a physical object. Like we have all these physical objects, the Ark of the Covenant and, other things that are viewed as holy, the incredible transgression to enter the Ark without, on the wrong day or the wrong person, without the proper blessings and so on. But the first thing to be declared holy is the seventh day. And this is right in the beginning of Genesis. Not only is it declared holy, but God observes it. God rests on the seventh day, but he can't be resting because he's tired, because God doesn't get tired. But it's quite amazing. It's basically, I think what we're being told is that that God observes the Sabbath. That the Sabbath has kind of, it's so amazing just to talking about it. But in any event, it's the centrality of time. And in the Jewish tradition, and there's a wonderful book that I talk about in my book called The Sabbath by Abraham Yashua Heschel. And it's a short book, it's like a classic about what the Sabbath is. And he explains that the Sabbath in the Jewish tradition is not a day of mortification. It's not even a day of religious study. It's actually kind of a joyous celebration of life, and it's not work, and it's not argumentation, but it's fine clothes, and it's the fine Sabbath meal, and it's enjoying the blessings of life. And so that's part of on a tradition. It's also linked to saying grace at meals and an appreciation of what we have rather than just the focus on what we don't have. So a lot of that is part of what I call graceful living and graceful simplicity. And I talk about it. But anyhow, that's became, but what I say in graceful simplicity, which is while living simply and gracefully is the good life, and part of the real thing that's missing from American life is that there's no grace in American life. It's harsh. It's harsh, and it's anguished, and it's rushed, and we don't have the time to do anything right, whether it's our relations with our children, with our friends. So it's a projection of a different kind of life, graceful living. But the other contribution of the book is argue for a politics of it. I say you can get this as an individual to some extent by radically trading stuff for time. That is cutting back to below the poverty level, in which because you've chosen it, it's not poverty, and because you're educated, it's not poverty. And you can work one day a week and eat rice and take a vitamin pill and buy all your clothes in the Salvation Army and live in a group house and self-educate your children and not send them to college and so on. And you can craft together actually a vibrant life. And a lot of people have written books on this. And if you went into a bookstore and you wanted to read about simple living, you'd get pointed to the self-help section of the bookstore, which is all these narratives about how to do this, how you can downshift and so on. But I said in my book is that as true as it is, as Walden Pond as it is, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's really irrelevant for most people. It involves such a cultural transformation that, that we're talking about a tiny percentage of people that are going to do this. What we need actually is public policy that opens up as a realistic way of living your life, a simple living option. And to do that, we need what I call the politics of simplicity. And I wrote about this in 1999 when the book first came out. And it was, by the way, it was a selection on the paperback book of the month club, and it's been translated into Chinese and Danish. So and it was published by Henry Holt. I mean, it wasn't some dud book. It was, and it's still in print. I mean, University of California Press has the paperback rights to it, and you can still buy it. And what the book went on to do is to actually lay out of simplicity would be. That is, it laid out the public policy agenda for, in fact, making the United States a society that's user-friendly for people who want to live more simply, that is, have what I call the alternative American dream. And the subtitle in the paperback edition is not the philosophy and politics of simple living, it's the philosophy and politics of the alternative American dream. And the alternative American dream is actually not making it. It's not to be Donald Trump or even to be, in the top 10%. It's to have a stable source of income. And for that, we propose a guaranteed job, we call it guaranteed basic employment, which is 4 days a week of a legal right to job system labor. Okay, so that's one of our policy proposals in the plan. So security, right? So, but security to an income flow that's sufficient, but doesn't have to be more than sufficient to make your basic needs. So to make it sufficient, we're in favor of continuing to push the minimum wage higher and continuing to expand the earned income tax credit to give people more cash in their pocket. What people don't know about the earned income tax credit, it's that it basically is the government sending people checks like UBI, Universal Basic Income. Except unlike UBI, it doesn't go to everybody. It goes to those people with need, those people who, in particular, the working poor or the working low income. So it's an earned income tax credit, right? But it's refundable. So if you're so poor that you have no tax bill, you simply get the money anyhow. The government sends you a check in April, okay? So it's a very powerful thing. What most people don't know, I mean, I worked on Capitol Hill for 4 years and then in the executive branch for 10. And so I know, and I have a second master's degree in public affairs, and I spent 25 years in the School of Public Policy at the University of Maryland. So I'm as wonky as the next guy, okay, in Washington. You know, I was a GS-15, and I'm sort of in that civil service, Capitol Hill staffer space. You know, I'm not just some, you know, I would say woolly haired, but I don't have any hair. But you know, I'm not just the 1960s radical. I'm a 1960s radical who went into public policy because I taught for 4 years philosophy at the University of Pennsylvania when I came out of grad school. And then I changed my career to go into policy. But even in the anti-war days of 68, I was clean for Gene. I was that part of the anti-war movement that thought we could win this thing through politics and we could drive Johnson out of the White House. And we did, right? We ran Gene McCarthy against him. We preferred Bobby Kennedy and he wouldn't go in unless, you know, he wanted to see the polls or whatever. And so he didn't have the courage. But we got Gene McCarthy to do it. And I was actually part of the behind the scenes effort that was run by a guy named Aled Lowenstein, a Democrat, Aled Lowenstein in New York, a real dynamo, was part of this effort to see if it was possible to recruit someone to run against LBJ. And McCarthy was a senator from Minnesota, of course. And I was doing I went back to school to get my master's degree in Minnesota at the School of Public Policy. But no, but I'm sorry, I'm mixing things. That I did later. This is 68, so I'm on the University of Michigan campus, right? And there's someone on the campus, one of my professors, a guy named Arnie Kaufman, social philosopher, and he's very much into the left wing of the Democratic Party and friends with Lowenstein. And he comes to me to say, we couldn't get Bobby Kennedy, maybe we can get Gene McCarthy. We don't really know enough about him. Can you put together a package of information on McCarthy's voting record? And so I stopped going to classes and spent 2 days in the University of Michigan library putting together a brief on Gene McCarthy that Arnie Kaufman and Howard Lowenstein used to build enough support for them to go as a block to Gene McCarthy and say, you'll have our support if you decide to go in against LBJ. And McCarthy did. And he did really well. And I went to Wisconsin with like 1,000 people from the University of Michigan campus to promote McCarthy's victory in the Wisconsin primary. This is in, you know, for the 1968 election. And on the eve of that primary, Johnson gives a special press conference. And we're sitting there, we think that we're going to win the primary the next day, which would be staggering, right? Because we knocked at every door in Milwaukee and, you know who the McCarthy voters are, and we're going to bring them to the polls the next day. So Johnson gets on the television and he announces, one, he's halting the bombing of Hanoi, big move that in terms of the war. And two, he announces that he decided not to run for re-election. You couldn't believe it. I mean, pandemonium. We drove him out of the election, and he knew that he was going to lose. Anyway, so that's sort of my background. Okay.
Okay.
Yeah,
Yeah.
let me
What's up?
send in the link.
Okay. Yeah. So Justinian, can you make an appeal like specifically to like why should Eastern Shore people like vote for Jerome? How is he going to improve their lives on the Eastern Shore? You know.
Yeah, so the Eastern Shore has a lot of hardworking people here, whether it's watermen or farmers or people working at schools, hospitals, anywhere in between, videographers like myself. We all want to work hard. We all want to do our best. But I think everybody needs a break. And one thing that the pandemic showed me personally is that I was running my business at the detriment of my own mental health. pre-pandemic. And so I had to change some things around. And I think with our living wage policy matrix, as Jerome calls it, we'll have the chance to really give back to our communities in a way that allows them to open up for more passion work and to be able to spend time doing things that they want to do instead of things that necessarily they need to do to keep them from starving to death. So that's what this whole 4-day work week living wage sort of matrix. Because the Eastern Shore is gorgeous. I live in Galena. We're about a mile from the Sassafras River. I go kayaking, I go biking, I go hiking and camping. I love the Eastern Shore, but before the pandemic, I didn't really have much time to enjoy this beautiful part of Maryland that I lived in because I was working so hard. Being self-employed, that's my own fault. But I think a lot of people, if they had more free time, would either spend it in nature or working on things that they love. Obviously, you need to fix the roads. Obviously, you need to make sure that we still have hospitals on the Eastern Shore, and broadband is a big issue, internet connectivity for those of us who work here, especially in areas like Kent County, we're the least populated county in the entire state. But I think it's a really important thing to look not only at what will help our economy be stable on the Eastern Shore, but also what will help our culture and our community. You know, the Eastern Shore is a special place. We have our own sort of culture here. And so voting for Jerome and I will help us to open up policies that enable people on the Eastern Shore not only to live in a stable lifestyle, but also to embrace more deeply the beautiful things that we have here on the shore.
Right. So can you guys kind of marry that with the bread and roses philosophy? Like bread and roses is also like a policy package that you have. So could you explain how these policies are going to impact and improve lives of people on the Eastern Shore, more specifically? And Jerome is here now, so whoever wants to answer.
Go ahead, Justin. I like to listen to you. I don't get a chance to listen to you too much.
Okay.
Yeah, absolutely. So with our lives on the Eastern Shore, we're talking about policies that one, reduce the costs of living for people here. We have a lot of issues with people leaving, right? Some of these smaller towns are slowly withering away into nothing. And we need to find a sustainable way to keep the Eastern Shore vibrant. And one of the big things that we have is tourism, right? People coming over either to the beaches down in Ocean City or in Delaware, or spending time on the rivers, boaters, all of that. And I think we can really lean into that sort of leisure time and leisure activities. And as we say with bread and roses, we need to make life beautiful. And part for me, and I think for a lot of people who choose to live here on the shore, is the natural beauty of the Eastern Shore of Maryland. And so if people are working 4 or 4.5 days a week, they'll have more time to go and do things that they love, which means that we will have more tourism income. We'll have our bed and breakfasts full again. We'll have people coming to our festivals and events like the Sultana Downrigging Festival, or any, St. Michael's has great festivals as well down there, and, up and down the shore. But when we're trapped in a 9-to-5 job, where if we want to take more time off to enjoy things with our family, we'll be penalized or fired, it doesn't give people even the option to take these opportunities because they're so focused on trying to make ends meet, or at the very least, they're beholden to their job due to contractual obligations. And so what our policies are hoping to do is open up life for the rest of living outside of work. And that's really the roses part of bread and roses.
Cool. So I kind of you guys have a policy that this is one of my favorite policies, which is the state guaranteed basic employment. And I was kind of hoping, because you were talking about the Wooling EV and producing these in Maryland, for example, like would this be the type of job that people can have under a state guaranteed basic employment program? Like in particular, like a lot of watermen experience seasonal unemployment, and I kind of want to know what are some jobs they can do under your policy package.
Well, I mean, they could do anything actually, because one of the ways in which, you see, it's going to be a legal right. There's been a talk about a right to a job since FDR. I mean, he in his inaugural address, his State of the Union address in 1944, he talked about what was called the Second Bill of Rights, and one of those things was sort of the right to a job, but it was sort of he had like this expectation that everybody recognized that people had a right to a job. And no legislation has ever been, may have been introduced, actually it was introduced as part of Humphrey Hawkins' bill when I was on the Hill, but no legislation has ever been passed that guaranteed anyone a right to a job, not in any state and not federally, though there was legislation to create such a right nationally, but it was taken out of the bill. It's a very important bill, the Humphrey Hawkins Act in 1978, I believe it was, in order just to pass, because you couldn't pass it. One of the things about it is, first of all, one of the reasons that we have guaranteed basic employment, it's not just that we advocate the 4-day work week, it's also that the policy tools for implementing a legal guarantee to a job when you're talking about 4 days a week are very powerful and different than when you're talking about 5 days a week. One of the reasons that there hasn't been a legal right to a job before is that people have held up the specter of basically the government in order to fulfill that right. If the private sector isn't hiring enough people, then the government will have to hire them. And so you've got this open-ended commitment for the government to hiring everybody, so there's no unemployment. And that's kind of a horror story. I mean, it's a horror story for me too. I mean, it's a budget breaker. It would take money away from every other decent thing that you want to do with the federal budget. It's completely unsustainable. It's make work. It's it really is terrible. It's just terrible. But with a 4-day guarantee, what you can do is you can provide incentives for people who are working 5 days to go down to 4. So let's say somebody is running a little business, right? And he needs, let me see if I can do the math in my mind. Let's say he needs 200 hours of labor time to produce his widgets, right? And he's got 5 guys working on their 40 hours a week, right? So, and let's say that he's considering, for instance, laying off one of those guys. So he'll go down to 160 hours or whatever it is. He'll go down from 200. I didn't do the arithmetic exactly right, but here's the point. So he'll go down, let's say 40 hours to 160, and one person will be completely out of work and get unemployment insurance benefits and so on, and the others will remain. But if what your guarantee is for a 4-day work and you're pushing that anyhow, what you'll do is you'll provide incentives for the 4 guys who would have remained on the job at 40 hours a week to themselves go down to 32. So they'll each throw in, as it were, have them each throw in, let's say, well, we want them each to go down 32. So each of them will throw in 8 hours, and you'll have 4 8 hours. So you'll have a 32-hour, a fifth. So you'll end up with five 32-hour jobs. And you'll give people financial incentives to do that. And it won't be that costly for a variety of reasons. One, you've got the saved unemployment insurance benefits. So you use those insurance benefits to give it to people who are, rather than being fully unemployed from the point of view of the federal government, now are just 8 hours unemployed, right? So you split up the uninsurance benefits. Moreover, you'll be giving people leisure in which to pursue their passion work. In fact, giving them the right, but it won't count against anything else. They won't lose their benefits for this. You'll give them the right to see if they can earn some money with their passion work, right? So it becomes a win-win-win, you know? And so people will move towards this. They'll say, "Are you kidding? You're going to give me half of my pay for the 8 hours that I give up. So I won't have to work those 8 hours. I'll still get paid half of it through unemployment insurance, and I'll be able to try and see if I can, make some money, as it were, being a baker or a playwright or, a Bible scholar or, an activist or, working for the church and so on, but doing what really turns me on. I might even make some money and come out ahead." Well, that's incredible, right? So this, and guess what? There already is federal legislation that makes it possible to apply the unused unemployment insurance money to distribute it to the people that take this part-time cut. And we should have used that in the pandemic rather than, this is someone asked a question, what do you think about Hogan? Well, one of the things he should have done is gone to work sharing. And there was a federal program there, and there was a ton of federal money for this purpose. And he should have focused on it. And we could have kept everybody in a firm, let's say that had 10 or more people, we could have kept everyone on the payroll. And it's very detrimental to people's work ethic and their psyche and, just the scrambled eggs of insecurity and so on to go on to unemployment. So we could have kept everybody on the payroll, with the right governor. And, it's just below the level. We got a secretary. I don't want to get into criticizing other candidates, but I don't hear anybody else putting forward this kind of idea. When they they get asked, how did Hogan do? Well, I think he did pretty well. Well, compared to what? Compared to what?
Yeah.
We didn't have to have unemployment go up. In fact, we could right now be driving unemployment down to zero in Maryland, because it wasn't just legislation for the pandemic. There's standing legislation that allows you to do this. And Brookings has a very useful paper out on this that came out a few years ago. So it's not even, it's not even a Jerome Segal policy idea. Where I come in is linking this thing to, transforming the culture in America. And to give you a sense of what the transformation means, if we have a society in which people are doing passion work, half of the normal work week, let's say they're doing it 2.5 days a week, right? That means that capitalist system, right? Job, instrumental, sell your brain, sell your human capital to the highest bidder, instrumental work is only taking up 2.5 days of your life, right? Okay. So you get a call, from your college roommate, and he tells you, guess what? I'm getting married, right? And you say, let's say it was a guy, and you say, so, well, I don't know what pronouns you'll use, but let's say you're just routine, and you say, well, who are you marrying? Who are you marrying? What is what does she do? What does she do? And so, well, they'll tell you. They'll say, well, she's a school teacher, or they'll tell you, well, she's still in school, but she's expects to get a job, in the IT industry, and or she's really got a great career. She's actually in architecture school, or she's an architect, and or she's actually working for a Wall Street firm, or whatever. But all the answers are going to be, how does she make her money? They're all answers of what's her role within capitalism, right? What's her role in the job system? That's her identity.
That's the craziest thing is when we ask people, what do you do at weddings and gigs that I do? What do you do? I have a garden. I go kayaking. I got my scuba license. I'm going to India. I'm excited for a bonfire. But it's always, what do you do that keeps you from starving to death is the most important aspect about anyone's personality when you meet them or hear about someone new.
That's right. And so the transition to a society in which basically everyone contributes and everyone gets enough that in exchange for their contribution, they have a stable source of income sufficient to live frugally and meet their needs, but have lots of time to do their passion work. The transition to that creates a change in identity, such that the next time you're in the Safeway and somebody is bagging, your groceries, rather than just, making chit chat with them, if you do it, you consider, this may be T.S. Eliot who's bagging my groceries. This may be Bob Dylan. This may be Picasso. We don't know anymore who somebody is, right? Because of what their job system work is. And that's a classless society in a different sense than Marx meant it, or that any Marxist or anybody other than Bread and Roses understands the notion of what it means to have a classless society. It means basically to have passion work be such a large part of how we spend our time that people are not defined by how they make their money, but by what their passion work is, what their values are, and how much excellence they have at it. There's enormous difference between somebody who really, really, is a beautiful painter, or a beautiful cook, or a beautiful landscape artist, artisan, or and so on, and someone who's not. And part of what we're talking about is as one of the objectives of education, and God, don't get me started on the Kirwan Commission blueprint. I mean, Maryland has just subjected itself to the most oppressive, empty-minded version of what the mission of schools are that anyone could design if you had the devil in charge of education policy. I mean, it is so crazy. You know what it is? It's basically we devote the education system to the job system. We taxpayers, here it is in a nutshell, we taxpayers are going to make sure that every Maryland person has the human capital developed at such a pitch that they can succeed in the job market, meaning, as it were, that they can fit the niche that the job creator who wants to buy your human capital to make his maximized profits, he can do that without having to pay for that human capital, because the taxpayers will put more and more money into the education system in order to make us perfect free gifts to the 10th of 1% that own all the corporations. I mean, it's amazing. It's amazing. And all these people who talk about equity and justice and so on, it passes them right by. They don't even see that this is what's going on. No less think about, well, maybe there's some other missions for schools, like America is or should be having an awakening about the horrible, horrible history of slavery and racism and oppression that was part of the American story from 1619. I wouldn't say unchanged, changed enormously, but still part of the story today. Well, maybe that should be the heart of the curriculum. Maybe that's what America needs right now. Or maybe people need something different. Or in addition to that, maybe they need the tools to enjoy all this leisure that we're going to make possible. So what do people do? What do people do, let's say, when they have leisure and money? So let's say you're retired, and you're wealthy and you're living on the Upper West Side, right? What do? Well, of course, you might fly to Greece, and you might fly, to Luxor, and and the third world. The third world, of course, is so much more beautiful than our world. I mean, go into a souk in Morocco or Egypt and look at a display of figs and nuts in the marketplace, and you whip out your camera to take pictures to hang on your wall, and then consider going over to Giant or Safeway, to pick up a bag of pistachios, and it'll suddenly hit you. Like something has gone wrong here. We call it, we think of ourselves as we're the cutting edge of development and so on. We're an ugly, graceless society, and that's why I want Maryland to be the graceful simplicity state, because we can model a better way of living for every other country, and that'll affect climate change, because they won't pursue our mass consumption model. Yeah, Justin, sorry, go ahead.
Yes, speaking of living gracefully, I do have to leave to go film at an art gallery in a bit. I leave you two to continue the conversation. If you'd like to connect with me, you can visit segalforgovernor.org or facebook.com/ESPIGROW. I don't have personal social media anymore after the debacle of the last election and all that arguing, but you can keep in touch via my permaculture sustainability page. I am the only manager of that page, so I'll respond there if you have any direct questions, either about the Eastern Shore or about the work that I'm doing. So facebook.com/ESPIGROW, email ESPIGROW@sbgrow@gmail.com, and segalforgovernor.org. Thank you everyone very much for having me.
Thanks,
Justinian.
so much. Thanks so much.
Brian.
Yep. Yeah, so we can go for like another. I mean, I've wanted 11.
All right, so I never really got to the foreign policy part of this.
Well, I was thinking,
Yeah.
Do you want to like do another one after this? Because like it's 20 minutes is like not enough to talk about foreign policy.
Yeah, I'd love to. I'd love to. I love this. This is great. And actually, my a lot of my thoughts are kind of crystallizing as we're talking here. Like some of the stuff I've been formulating, I had not half as tight as some it just came out in my humble impression.
Yeah, so do you want to like do like a foreign policy talk like another time, and maybe we'll
Sure,
kind of we'll
that's
kind of
great.
just wrap
That's
up
great.
with domestic issues.
Yeah,
So one question I have about about federal guaranteed employment or state guaranteed
yeah,
employment is the Federal Reserve is ideologically opposed to full employment, and I don't know how to navigate,
yeah,
this when the Federal Reserve is increasing rate hikes. I mean, we're probably going to
yeah,
get a recession in two to
yeah,
4 years because
yeah,
of these rate hikes.
yeah,
Like, how do you
yeah.
navigate this?
Yeah. So this is a great question because I'm really actually interested in this. First of all, from a legal point of view, they're not. From a legal point of view, and this I mentioned before, the Humphrey Hawkins bill of 1978, that bill changed the mandate of the Federal Reserve from being just about fighting inflation to also being about promoting full employment. So the Federal Reserve has what's called a dual mandate. It has a dual mandate. Now, you could raise the question of how do we fight unemployment with the Federal Reserve, and there you're getting to the trade-off, right? And this is the malevolence of economists, really. I mean,
Hmm.
I had an undergraduate major in economics and almost went to grad school in economics. I do this master's in public policy, but for economists, right, and take someone like he was on the Council of Economic Advisors. He's at Harvard. He's a really distinguished macroeconomist. I can't even remember his name. But in any event, he was in the Post just the other day, right? And he's talking about the importance of the Federal Reserve getting its act together in fighting the inflation before it gets out of hand, and says very explicitly that we have to be willing to accept some unemployment for this, because the way in which the federal government deals with inflation, right? The way in which it deals with inflation is by it views inflation as too much money running after too few goods, right?
Yeah.
Bidding it up. And so it wants to suppress demand, right? So it raises interest rates. And by doing that, it cuts down spending. And you cut down spending, and suddenly you've got more stuff being supplied than is being bought, right? And so you start laying people off because you don't need them anymore. So that's how you get unemployment. So building unemployment is the trade-off. Now, from an equity point of view, what it means is that the people who are unemployed are the ones who pay the price for controlling inflation. Okay.
Yeah.
Nobody in this country that I know of is really talking about macroeconomic justice. Okay. But what macroeconomic justice would be this question of, why should the weakest segment of the society, the poorest people and the people with the most unstable jobs, be the ones who pay the price of getting stable prices in this country? That's like, who pays the cost of dealing with climate change? Only in spades, because it's so much more powerful, because the price of suffering unemployment is fantastic. I mean, that's what destroys families. It destroys self-confidence. It breeds, the inherited cycles of poverty. Almost everything about the transmission of the distribution of income and wealth that's bad goes through unemployment. That's how people lost their houses, right? You talk about the wealth gap, right? So the Great Recession, right, had all of these foreclosures on the Black population. Why? Because they lost their income stream because they were unemployed, right? So, but the fundamental question of why do we fight inflation by having this burden fall on this segment? So I wrote about this. Okay. I wrote about this in 1977 in a paper that was published by the House Budget Committee, or the Budget Committee of the House of Representatives, because I was on its staff. I created or had the idea of creating, the congressman I worked for created it, a lens, a social equity or social justice lens through which to look at every federal policy and every budget policy. Okay, nothing like that ever existed. And it went out of existence when my congressman lost the race, he lost his seat, or he had to give up his seat, and I left the Hill. So it existed really for only about 2 years. But it was a lens, a social equity lens, for looking at every bit of policy. And it was called the House Budget Committee Task Force on the Distributive Impacts of Budget and Economic Policy. And we could take anything and we would hold hearings. We'd bring experts to Washington and we would ask them a question, who's going to benefit from this legislation and who's going to bear the burden? And we'd hold those hearings and we would publish those hearings and we would bring the press to those hearings and we would hold press conferences and we would write reports. And this is what we did for the 2 years that we were there. And one of those hearings, by the way, was on the absence of sufficient data on the distribution of wealth in the United States, this staggering amount of income distribution. But in those days, almost no series for the regular collection of information on who owns America, which is the distribution of wealth rather than what do people earn, right?
Uh-huh.
And so we brought to Washington the academic experts of this and held hearings for 2 days on this, and then published reports on this, and they in their testimony they attached their data, and so we became a source for distributing unpublished data on the distribution of wealth in the United States. So this is different today. I mean, the Federal Reserve does a lot, and a lot of people are into distribution of wealth. But I say this for a variety of reasons. At first, we haven't fulfilled the mission of this, and I wrote a paper on the differences in unemployment rates, the distribution of unemployment between racial and gender groups, and sort of underscored that that we have this staggering, macroeconomic injustice, and we need macroeconomic fairness, which has to do with a fair distribution of the burden for fighting inflation. Now, how else can we fight inflation? Well, there was a point at which the United States had 1.7% unemployment, right? A few years. You won't believe that because we have historically low rates of unemployment now or before the pandemic, and it was like 3.9%. We cracked through what economists used to call the natural rate of unemployment, below which they thought that you would just automatically have runaway inflation.
Right.
But we sort of did it, and the Federal Reserve acted, I think, rightly, with some confidence that inflation wasn't necessarily going to come down like hot lava on us. And so now there's a question of whether or not we're in it or we're not in it, and so on. Different people disagree as to whether or not inflation is going to abate or not. And that's in another talk when we talk about oil and gasoline. I've got a lot to say about that. But in any event, there are other ways of fighting inflation, right? And we had this period in which we had unemployment down to unbelievable levels of like 1.7% for a couple of years. How much was the inflation rate? 20%, 30%? What did we pay for doing that? Well, it turns out that the inflation rate in one of those years was, 4%. And another one of those years, it was 2%. It averaged, I think, 3.5%, relatively stable prices, when we had unemployment at a level at which there was just absolutely no unemployment in the country whatsoever, which is great. It's great for labor markets. It means that you can get a job in almost anything that you want, because nobody has a surplus of people employing. You can travel any way you want. You can move if you want. You can get a job anywhere at anything. So it's just great. It's just great. Okay, when was that? Well, it was 1943 to 1944. It was during the war. And why was it during the war? It was during the war because during the war we dealt with inflation by having strict, powerful wage and price controls. And if there was 3% inflation, it was because we permitted there to be 3% inflation. Nobody could raise prices, which is actually very interesting because it goes back to an old American tradition. The idea that we're governed by markets to determine prices, that's new. That's as new as the job system. Western society never had that. We lived for centuries and centuries and centuries under a religious tradition of the just price, right? That was developed, I think Aquinas developed the just price, and he built it out of the prohibition against usury that's in the Bible. And it developed into actually restrictions on it. And in the 18th century or in the 17th century, and I mentioned this in my book, there was a very famous trial in New England of a guy named John Kane. And he was tried for raising prices. And he was found guilty. He was found guilty by the courts. And in the pulpits, when they talked about this, his sin of grasping this was talked about as his living under the illusion that it was all right for people to buy as cheaply as they could and sell as dearly as they could. That is, to make as much money, to do what today we believe is the path to the American dream. Start a business, buy cheap and sell high, invest your money in your 401k, figure out the bargain stocks, sell them at the top of the market. It's the ethos. It's the ethos of America, right? Well, this isn't the ethos that this culture or this American society was founded on. We were founded within a just price tradition. And whether we go back to just price, which is some of what I would do if I was governor about gasoline, I would enact, cost, average price of production plus 10% profit margin is a just price, and make it illegal to sell gasoline in Maryland at anything above that. And if they try to cut off the supply of gasoline to one of our states, Maryland, I would make that a criminal felony and put out arrest warrants for the head of every oil company, distribution or production that did that, and send extradition orders to every state in the country. And maybe we'd invoke the Fugitive Slave Act and send out some catchers and bring some of these buggers back and put them in jail in Maryland. And let me tell you, just talking about that, you don't have to do any of this stuff. You don't have to do any of this stuff. You just have to talk about it. You just have to talk about it, and they'll fall in line. You think any CEO anywhere, they're worried about their company facing a civil suit. Can you imagine if they were facing the possibility of criminal liability charges in the state of Maryland, and whether or not they'd be extradited, and had to fight extradition charges in California? And then we'd have a movement in California that would be lock them up. We would be saying lock them up, and it would be great. It would be the funniest thing in the world. We would be yelling lock them up to bring these guys back. Well, the point is that they'd have the just price in Maryland. And if they just priced in Maryland, they'd have to do it everywhere in the country, right? They did it everywhere in the country. We wouldn't have had the spike in prices and the inflation impact that we had from the rise of the international barrel of oil. Well, this is there for the taking. It's there for the taking. Biden's problem is that his Council of Economic Advisors is filled with economists. He needs historians on there. Economics, inflation is not a problem of economics. Sounds radical, okay? You had Milton Friedman, right? The guru, right? Announcing not only that, but narrower. Inflation everywhere is a problem, a monetary problem, a problem of too much money chasing too few goods, right? You deal with it by dealing with the money supply. Wrong. Inflation has nothing to do with the amount of money. Inflation actually is a sociological phenomenon. Inflation occurs when people who have the power to raise their prices. In other words, when real people and real institutions take down one sign and put up another. And if that doesn't happen, there's no inflation. Okay, that's social behavior. Now, many things can affect that social behavior. For instance, a law prohibiting anything but just pricing, and they're not going to do it. 1943 and 44 and 45, right? Wage and price controls. Nobody did it, right?
Uh-huh.
The whole culture of Western society for a millennium. People did not live under the assumption that it was just fine to set your prices at whatever the market could bear. So it's sociology. And the question is, how do we get other ways to control prices. And there are gillions of them. There are gillions of them. You just have to think creatively. So when you leave inflation to the Federal Reserve, or you leave it to economists, you've already tied, both hands behind your back, or you basically put blinders on your in front of your eyes. And it's the dumbing down. It's the dumbing down of discourse that actually the proliferation of social science has created.
Well, I
It's
agree with
all
that. I
over
agree
the
with
place.
that.
It's all over the place. And by the way, I was talking about the Kirwan Commission and its stupid stuff
Uh,
on education, and what it advances is basically as the criteria of whether or not somebody's getting a decent education is whether or not they meet a career or college ready criterion, which means getting a good job, whether after college or before college. And guess what? Operationally, the test of whether or not people in schools have met that, because they're not looking at, well, really, what do you need to do well on a job? Like, do you have good personal skills? And can we evaluate whether or not people have these personal skills when they leave high school? No, we can't measure that. What can we measure? Well, we can measure how they do on math exams and reading comprehension exams. So let's do that. Because after all, we've got to measure something. How can we hold people accountable? How can we be responsible if we can't measure something and make decisions on the basis of that? So we set up, that becomes the criteria of whether or not we've got, quote unquote, a world-class education system, which means, if you can believe it, that American students on these standardized tests are doing as well as kids in Shanghai and Singapore and the Netherlands. I mean, this is what the state of Maryland enacted as its version of the mission of schools. And everybody on this campaign, every other candidate on this campaign, if you say the word blueprint, they'll say, the most wonderful thing that ever happened to Maryland, the blueprint. Why? Because the blueprint is a two-headed monster. One part of it is about the social justice lens, and it saw school funding and school policy and school construction and the school budget through the social equity lens. And it reached the solid conclusion that there's no social justice there. And it took major gold standard steps to right the wrong of how education money is spent between rich, poor, white, black, and so on in Maryland. And so that's the part of the blueprint that's great. All of that can be in place over 10 different visions of what the mission of schools are, right?
mm-hmm.
But when you get to the question of the mission of the schools, that was also part of the Kirwan thing, and no one paid any attention to it. They just built it into law, and built into law an accountability board, which is like the Prussian army that's going to impose these tests of these, whether or not we've got a world-class, I love this term, world-class education system. It's like a soccer league, and it's just so moronic. If you Google Shanghai schools and anxiety, right, and you'll get whatever it is, umpteen tens of thousands of hits of people that have written about the rising level of anxiety that exists in Shanghai among children, maybe even suicide rates, because of what they do in order to get these high scores on these tests that make them have a world-class education system that the Kirwan Commission wants us to emulate. I mean, it is sick beyond belief. It's sick beyond belief.
Okay,
And on Saturday, by the way, I'm speaking to the Maryland State Education Association, the president of which has been named to this accountability board. And I've already told them in spades in a 15-minute interview with this woman, and written testimony. I tell them again, if I'm elected governor, I will go full stop to implement the social justice aspect of the blueprint. And I will pull out no stops whatsoever in preventing the implementation of this other stuff. We'll have a serious conversation about the mission of schools in Maryland. And I'll win that conversation with parents. We'll go right over the heads of the so-called educators who blindly impose this. But the thing that jammed us through actually is the need of bureaucrats to have something measurable. That's what I mean by the dumbing down. The dumbing down of social thought, like thinking about that inflation is a monetary phenomenon rather than a sociological phenomenon, goes hand in hand with the belief that we've got to have something measurable in order to make responsible public policy, so that we can quantify our evaluations. And it's insane. And Amartya Sen, bless him, who was a Nobel Prize winner and both an economist and a philosopher, put his finger on it. And he said, it's better to be vaguely correct than to be precisely wrong.
Yeah.
And what we've got, a world full of stupid people with a lot of power who prefer to be precisely wrong because they just don't understand history.
Yeah.
So, okay.
All
Anyway,
right. So yeah, I got to go to another meeting. Could you just shout out where people can find you at, your website, your social media, so on and so forth?
well, there are two things to look at. I don't know the social media thing. I think we do have something on Facebook, and we'll have to get better at that. I'm sort of from the generation that just doesn't understand this stuff, but Justin does, and we're getting better on that. We've got two websites that are really worth looking at.
Mhm.
One is the Bread and Roses website, and that's a more embracing thing. And
The call's going